In the first half of the 9th century, two power struggles unfolded side by side: the rise of the Kingdom of Pamplona and the slow unraveling of the Carolingian Empire under Louis the Pious. Why did the lords of Pamplona prefer paying tribute to Muslim Córdoba over submitting to the Franks? And how did the empire built by Charlemagne begin to fracture? I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain. In episode 32, I will tell you the story of shifting loyalties in Vasconia and the Carolingian Wall. Vasconia at the dawn of the early Middle Ages. If you are new here, don't forget to subscribe to the show on YouTube or as a podcast. You can also support me financially via Patreon or through one-time donations. Links are in the description. Before talking about the formation of the Kingdom of Pamplona, it's important to understand the situation in the region of Vasconia beforehand. When I refer to Vasconia, I'm excluding French Vasconia or Gascony, and instead including the Basque Country, Navarre, and parts of La Rioja and the Upper Aragon region, which at the time had a culture more Vasconic than Latin. During the Visigothic era, Vasconia was a peripheral region not under Visigothic control. It had local militias that exercised leadership over very small, poor geographic areas. This helps explain why the Vascons often resorted to banditry and raiding, and why their society had relatively low inequality and a high degree of social mobility, depending on one's fortune in war. Vasconia was open to both Frankish and Visigothic influences, but it remained a territory outside the authority of any kingdom, with Pamplona as its only significant urban center, home to a bishop. Christianity gradually took root between the 5th and 8th centuries, although some pagan communities may have persisted into the 8th and 9th centuries. With the Islamic conquest, Vasconia came under partial Muslim control. A garrison and some North African Muslim civilians settled in Pamplona, and some native landowners, like the Banu Qasi, converted to Islam. After the Islamic conquest, Christian Vasconic elites were buried with prestige items such as rings bearing Arabic inscriptions. Even if they couldn't read them, these objects signified social status due to their connection with the new rulers of the Iberian Peninsula. The history of Pamplona, and of Vasconia as a whole between the last third of the 8th century and the early years of the 9th, is quite obscure and confusing due to the scarcity of sources. By then, it's likely that the Berber Muslim garrison and their families had already left the Navarrese capital. As discussed in episode 29, Charlemagne in Spain fighting wars and heresies, the Franks first entered Vasconia in the campaign of 778, which devastated the region and led to the destruction of Pamplona's walls. However, groups of Vascons defeated the Franks at the First Battle of Roncesvalles. In the campaign of Emir Abdelrahman I in 781, we hear of two native magnates, Jimeno the Strong and García Velasco Tenes. Some scholars believe Jimeno may have been the common ancestor of the Arista and Jimena dynasties that would later rule the Kingdom of Pamplona. García Velasco Tenes is thought to have controlled the Aragonese region of Sobrarbe, and to have been the father of Count García de Abad of Aragon. Vasconia once again became a territory generally not integrated into any state, politically fragmented into local chiefdoms led by strongmen with clan networks, who sometimes had to submit to Córdoba by providing hostages and paying tribute. Íñigo Arista and the founding of the Kingdom of Pamplona. By the year 799, the chronicler Ibn Hayyan briefly reported that people from Pamplona had betrayed and assassinated Mutarif ibn Musa of the Banu Qasi. However, since it's unclear whether Mutarif was acting as governor of Pamplona, or even whether he was visiting Pamplona at the time, this event is difficult to interpret. If we consider contemporaneous events, such as preparations for the Carolingian conquest of Barcelona, Mualat or Muslim Hispano-Gothic rebels siding with the Franks, and the arrival of Asturian ambassadors at the court of King Louis the Pious in Toulouse, we can reasonably hypothesize that those responsible for Mutarif's assassination were a pro-Carolingian faction within Pamplona. As discussed in episode 30, the era of Charlemagne, Spanish March, and Carolingian Empire, this faction prevailed for a few years. During the early 9th century, the governor of Pamplona was Velasco, a loyal supporter of the Franks. Thus, two rival factions emerged in Vasconia, which remained outside direct Islamic control, those seeking protection under the Carolingian court, and those favoring continued association with Al-Andalus and nominal recognition of the Umayyad emirs of Córdoba. Notably, both approaches aimed to preserve Vasconia's political autonomy, with only symbolic subordination to a distant central power. It was a delicate balancing act on the frontier between the Christian and Islamic worlds. With the appointment of Amr ibn Yusuf as governor of the Upper March, Umayyad control in the region was gradually restored. His growing power earned him enemies, and the Muwallad family of the Banu Qasi abandoned their loyalty to form a coalition of Christian forces from Upper Aragon, Álava, Castile, and Pamplona, likely including the Arista family, though this coalition was defeated in 806. Íñigo Arista was related to the Banu Qasi, as he was the stepson of Musa ibn Fortun and half-brother of Musa ibn Musa. Now is a good time to debunk a widely repeated claim: the supposed long-standing alliance between the Banu Qasi and the Arista dynasty until the latter was replaced by the Jimena or Sancha dynasty in 905. In fact, this alliance did not continue after Íñigo Arista's death in 851. The two families expanded into overlapping territories, and the Pamplonese rulers could ally with the Astur-Leonese monarchy, with Muwallad rebels, or with the Banu Qasi. There was no enduring strategic alliance. In the early 9th century, the Carolingian Empire was still trying to expand into Hispania. For example, Count Aznar I Galíndez recaptured the county of Aragon for the Carolingians after it had been taken by Amr ibn Yusuf. But by 812, Carolingian advances were halted following a peace treaty with Emir al-Hakam. King Louis the Pious sent troops into Pamplona to punish the rebellious Vascons. However, to return safely and avoid an ambush, he had to cross the Pyrenees with local women and children as hostages. This clearly illustrates the weakness of Carolingian authority in Vasconia, which seemed more like enemy territory than a loyal domain. In response to the waning Islamic influence in Vasconia, Emir al-Hakam launched a devastating raid in 816 against the territories controlled by Velasco on behalf of the Carolingians. This raid, along with a revolt in Gascony against Carolingian rule, shifted the region's balance of power, triggering instability and conflict. The defeat of 816 discredited Velasco and the pro-Carolingian faction, which lost control of Pamplona to those favoring alignment with Al-Andalus. According to historian Juan José Larrea, the Vascons found that submitting to their Frankish Christian co-religionists offered fewer guarantees of autonomy and non-interference than the Islamic Andalusi order. This becomes clearer when we consider what happened in Lombardy, Septimania, or Old Catalonia, regions where local counts and bishops were frequently replaced by Franks. After decades of tension, shifting alliances, and warfare in Vasconia, the leadership of Íñigo Arista emerged between 816 and 820. We know little about Íñigo Arista beyond his name, his ties to the Banu Qasi, and his death in 851. If primary sources are sparse for the Kingdom of Asturias, the situation is even worse for Pamplona. There is no native chronicle until much later periods, so we must rely on Arab, Frankish, and Astur-Leonese chronicles, as well as a few concise documents and genealogies, such as the Codex of Roda. One known event is that in the small county of Aragon, located in the northwestern part of present-day Aragon, García de Abad overreacted to a personal insult. He killed his brother-in-law, repudiated his wife, and expelled his father-in-law, Count Aznar I Galíndez, from Aragonese territory, with help from his new father-in-law, Íñigo Arista. Thus, García de Abad established himself in Aragon under the overlordship of the Pamplonese ruler, while Count Aznar appealed to the Carolingian Emperor for new territories to govern and was granted the counties of Urgell and Cerdanya. Under these circumstances, the annual Carolingian Imperial Assembly of 824 decided to launch a military expedition using troops from Gascony to restore Carolingian authority over Iberian Vasconia. The Carolingian army marched through what they called the land of the Vascons, Pamplonicis, and Navarrese, reached Pamplona, and seemingly completed their mission. But on the way back, as they passed through Roncesvalles Pass, they were ambushed and massacred. Count Eblus and Aznar were captured in what became known as the Second Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. That same year, while the Cordovan emir was campaigning in Álava and Castile, the Vascons sent Count Eblus to Abderrahman II as a gift and a show of obedience. Count Aznar was released because he had family ties to the victors. Thus, the year 824 marks the definitive triumph of the pro-Andalusi Vasconic elite over the pro-Carolingian faction. The Franks never again attempted to take Pamplona. So what were the limits of the Arista domain? Much like in the early years of the Kingdom of Asturias, it's an overstatement to speak of Pamplona as a kingdom in the 9th century. It's more accurate to describe it as a lordship. The Arista family's authority was limited to the area around Pamplona, extending north to Roncesvalles Pass and east to Sangüesa. The modern Basque Country and the southwestern part of present-day Navarre, including the area around Estella, lay beyond their control. Did Íñigo Arista found an independent Kingdom of Pamplona, or was he a local lord subject to Al-Andalus? The truth lies somewhere in between. From our modern perspective, with clearly defined state borders, we often forget that for most human history, boundaries were not rigid lines but fluid zones with their own dynamics. The formation of a kingdom was typically a gradual process, not a singular event with a specific start date. As historian Larrea has noted, 9th century rulers of Pamplona operated under a fragile dual legitimacy. Externally, they were seen as governors under the Emir of Córdoba, paying a token tribute. Internally, they were Christian sovereigns with royal symbols. Chronicler Ibn Hayyan refers to the Arista dynasty as emirs or lords of Pamplona and the Vascons, while he uses the term king or tyrant for the monarchs of Asturias. From the Islamic world's point of view, the Navarrese were often seen as uncivilized Christians from the fringes of the Muslim realm, too backward to properly embrace Islam, and at other times as rebels who needed to be subdued through force. Meanwhile, the Christian clergy, especially the more militant elements, and some Vascons under Arista rule, were uneasy with the dynasty's close ties to Muslims. This is reflected in later alliances with Oviedo and León, the presence of anti-Islamic polemical texts in 9th century Navarrese monasteries, and the absence of major shrines or monasteries near the capital. These internal contradictions within the Arista regime were eventually resolved in the 10th century, when Sancho Garcés of the Jimena or Sancha dynasty transformed Pamplona into a truly independent kingdom allied with the Astur-Leonese crown, opposing both Córdoba and the waning power of the Banu Qasi. To conclude this section with a brief note on the society of the Pamplonese lordship, we can say that the Vasconic society, conquered by Arabs and Berbers, was extremely poor, politically fragmented, and not very socially stratified. Between the 9th and 10th centuries, however, Navarrese and Aragonese society began to evolve, with increasing centralization of power. In late antique and early medieval Vasconia, there was no strong aristocracy. Until the 11th century, the only major landholders were the king, very few lords, and a few abbeys. And most peasants and herders in Navarre and Aragon during this period were free men, not serfs. Musa ibn Musa and the rise of the Banu Qasi. The Muwallad lineage of the Banu Qasi was one of the most prominent in the history of Al-Andalus, although their story has been somewhat mythologized. To begin with, the accounts of a great Gothic count named Cassius, who allegedly made a pact with the Muslims and became a client of the Umayyad Caliph of Damascus, appear only in sources written after the conquest. These accounts were part of the Banu Qasi's constructed memory, aimed at glorifying their family origins once they became a powerful dynasty in the 9th century. As Jesus Lorenzo Jiménez pointed out in his seminal study of the family, the Banu Qasi preserved their estates, unlike the descendants of King Witiza or Duke Theodemir, because their properties did not arouse the ambitions of the new Arab elite. It was during the 780s and 790s, a turbulent period for the Upper March due to the revolts by Arab and Muwallad leaders and Carolingian intervention, that the Banu Qasi began to appear in historical sources. At that time, they were still only one of several influential families in the region, holding lands between Tarazona, Borja, and Aragon, northwest of Zaragoza and in La Rioja. Initially, the Banu Qasi remained loyal to the Umayyad emirs, But when Amrus ibn Yusuf became the ruler of the Upper March, he likely took action against them. As we've seen, this led the Banu Qasi to form an alliance with notable Christian leaders in the region, though they were ultimately defeated. After the death of Amrus ibn Yusuf in 812, an opportunity arose for the Banu Qasi to gain dominance in the political arena of the Upper March. Starting in 839, Musa ibn Musa appears repeatedly as the most powerful political figure and magnate in the region. His deep local roots allowed him to oscillate between loyalty and rebellion without the emir being able to undermine his power base or replace the Banu Qasi. Asturian chronicles refer to Musa ibn Musa as the third king of Spain, but this was merely an exaggerated rhetorical flourish to amplify King Ordoño's victory over Musa at the Battle of Albelda. Musa never founded an independent kingdom and operated within the political framework of the Emirate of Córdoba and the Islamic world. His goal was to accumulate power and dominate the Upper March without interference from the emir. And after the death of Abdelrahman II, he succeeded. Musa is not mentioned in the early raids against Álava and Castile carried out by Emir Abdelrahman II. There is only a general reference to the usual participation or full leadership of frontier troops in those campaigns. Nevertheless, it's clear that the clan was consolidating its power during those years of absence from written sources. The emir likely refrained from attacking Pamplona due to the good relations between Íñigo Arista and the Banu Qasi, and because the Vascons were probably paying some small tribute. In 839, the emir sent an expedition to inspect the frontiers and reinforce fortifications. Musa ibn Musa took part with a raid into Álava and Castile, and his son, Fortun, defended Medinaceli in Soria from a Christian attack. Abdelrahman II rewarded Musa for his successful campaign with higher administrative and military posts, such as governor of Tudela and of the frontier's most distant territories. Being on the frontier involved greater risks than other provinces, but the potential rewards were also higher, as war with enemy territories allowed for plunder or negotiating deals with Christians. Those roles enabled Musa to expand the family's wealth and fortify Arnedo, one of the family's most important strongholds in La Rioja. By 841, Musa rebelled against the emir, reportedly due to a rivalry with a general close to the court. Indeed, Musa's rebellions were often directed more against the emir's delegates than against the emir himself. Abdelrahman II sent one of his most loyal clients to quell the rebellion. This general defeated Musa at Borja, captured the town defended by Musa's son, Lup, and forced Musa to surrender Tudela, which he could no longer defend. The envoy from Córdoba continued his campaign not only against the Banu Qasi, but also their relatives and allies in Pamplona, the Arista family. What the Umayyads did not expect was for Musa and Íñigo Arista to defeat the Cordoban general and take him prisoner. The emir responded quickly, launching another punitive expedition against Pamplona the following year. It returned to Córdoba with captives, but failed to subdue Musa ibn Musa or free the prisoners. The situation had become absurd and increasingly frustrating for the emir, who felt mocked. Once again, in 843, Abdelrahman II prepared a campaign against Pamplona, defended by a coalition of the Banu Qasi, the Arista family, and men from Álava and Castile. This time the rebels were less fortunate. One of Íñigo Arista's brothers and many other prominent figures in the coalition were killed, and Musa and Íñigo barely escaped. In Córdoba, the heads of the Pamplonese sovereign's brother and others were displayed as war trophies. A group of 60 Pamplonese sought pardon and began serving in the emir's army. Even a son of Íñigo Arista joined and had a son who converted to Islam and later served as governor of Huesca. Musa negotiated a pardon and agreed to release prisoners in exchange for being recognized as governor of Arnedo. Íñigo Arista took longer to surrender, and as a result, the campaign of devastation continued in the Navarrese countryside until he also agreed to release prisoners from Huesca and pay the small sum of 700 dinars annually to Córdoba as jizya, the tax imposed on Christians and Jews under Muslim rule, in return for the emir's recognition of his authority in Pamplona. None of these peace deals lasted. In 844, Musa attacked Tudela in an attempt to retake it, but upon seeing the army approaching, the Banu Qasi patriarch surrendered without a fight. This quick peace was also motivated by the emir's desire to regain Musa's loyalty to defend Al-Andalus against the first Viking raid on the Iberian Peninsula, which had caught them off guard. In 846, the Banu Qasi were once again disobedient because two brothers who ruled Zaragoza and Tudela used their positions to harass the Mualad family and their Pamplonese allies. Musa quickly returned to obedience while Vasconia suffered the consequences. A similar situation unfolded in 850 when the Banu Qasi attacked Tudela, Tarazona, and Borja once more. This time, Musa had to offer one of his sons as a hostage to secure forgiveness. Musa was like a persistent thorn in the emir's side, and since Abdurrahman was tired of launching yearly campaigns against him, he decided to restore the post of governor of Tudela to the Banu Qasi patriarch. Sometimes persistence pays off, and under the new Emir Muhammad, Musa was kept even more satisfied and loyal with the prestigious title of Governor of Zaragoza and the entire Upper March. The Carolingian Empire and the Spanish March under Louis the Pious. Setting aside the Vasconic territories, in the great Christian power of the West, Emperor Charlemagne died in 814 and was succeeded by his only surviving son, Louis, who had previously overseen affairs in southern France and the Iberian Peninsula as King of Aquitaine. Louis earned the nickname the Pious because at the very start of his reign, he raised moral standards, standardized the Benedictine rule for monasteries, and openly criticized the sexual behavior of his sisters and even his father's morality. One reason for this puritanical fervor was Louis's need to legitimize his rule against other Carolingian claimants, such as his nephew who maintained Italy as independent, until Louis had him blinded, causing his death. Louis later repented and did penance for this act. Meanwhile, his first wife died, and he remarried a noblewoman named Judith, who would later play a pivotal role in the empire's internal crisis. In the Spanish March in 816, the Emir Hakam ordered his uncle Abdallah, the Lord of Valencia, to attack Barcelona. Although Abdallah defeated the forces of Count Vera of Barcelona, he failed to recapture the city for the Muslims because Old Catalonia was better integrated with the rest of the Carolingian Empire than the central and western Pyrenees. That same Count Vera was accused of treason and in the court of Aachen in 820 fought a mounted trial by combat in the Gothic style to defend his honor. The accusation came from a subordinate of Count Gauselm of Roussillon and Empúries, a rival and half-brother of Vera, so it's likely that it was a baseless accusation born of envy. Vera, after all, governed not just Barcelona, but also Girona and the Pyrenean counties of Razès and Conflent. There is no solid reason to support the claim, common in Catalan historiography from the second half of the 20th century, that there was any sort of ethnic or ideological factionalism, like a Goth-leaning, peace-seeking secessionist Vera and a warlike pro-Frankish Gauselm. In any case, Vera lost the duel and was deemed guilty, but instead of being executed, Emperor Louis the Pious exiled him for the rest of his life. As a result of the trial by combat, Vera's son remained Count of Razès and Conflent, while Girona and Barcelona were entrusted to a Frankish noble. Thus, Gauselm rid himself of a rival, but he gained nothing directly. In 822, the Franks launched a raiding campaign in the province of Lleida, and in 825, a new Count of Barcelona and Girona was appointed, Bernard of Septimania, Gauselm's younger brother, who will play a crucial role in the coming Carolingian crisis. It was in this context that Aizo's revolt took place in 826 to 827. Aizo remains a mysterious figure in historiography, and the only thing we know for certain is that he escaped from a Carolingian prison. Three theories exist about his identity. One is that he was a Visigoth, another that he was an Arab lord from the frontier region of Osona who tried to halt Frankish advances, and the third, which seems most plausible, is that he was the now elderly Aisun, son of Suleiman al-Arabi, the former governor of Barcelona and Girona. If Aizo was indeed Aisun, then his actions can be seen as an attempt to return to a time when Barcelona and Girona were effectively independent from both Cordoban and Frankish control. Interestingly, the revolt was also supported by prominent local nobles, including Vera's son. The rebels first took control of Osona, a region in central Catalonia only weakly held by the Franks, and began attacking Cerdanya and Barcelona. When they learned that Bernard was advancing with an army under imperial orders, Íñigo requested assistance from the Emir of Córdoba. The Emir dispatched troops, and with these reinforcements, Íñigo and the rebels wreaked havoc across much of the Spanish Carolingian counties. Rather than confront the larger Carolingian army directly, the rebels accompanied the Muslims back to Córdoba, where they lived out the rest of their days. Because of the war, Osona lost population and remained a stateless territory until the late 9th century. Bernard's family gained additional counties, and Bernard himself was eventually granted control over Narbonne, Béziers, Agde, Mauguio, and Nimes, earning him the title of Duke of Septimania. However, the most significant outcome was the loss of power by two prominent aristocrats at court, Hugh of Tours and Matfrid of Orleans, which disrupted their client networks. The emperor's persecution of these figures triggered the first domino in a chain of events that would lead to civil war in the Carolingian Empire. Thus, it's not an exaggeration to say that Íñigo's revolt set off a butterfly effect with monumental consequences for European history. From Bernard's time onward, the Spanish March became deeply involved in the domestic politics of the Carolingian world. Bernard's political rise led the emperor to name him Chamberlain, but this also earned him many enemies at court. He was accused of committing adultery with Empress Judith, thus tainting the moral integrity of the palace, and was eventually forced to leave court and return to his southern domains. One of his brothers was captured, blinded, and exiled, and his brother Gauselm had to seek refuge and keep a low profile for a while. These tensions were tied to the factional conflict surrounding the deposition of Hugh of Tours and Matfrid of Orleans following Íñigo's revolt, and to the succession crisis over how the empire should be divided. Under Frankish tradition, the empire was not viewed as an indivisible political entity, but as private patrimony that could be divided upon inheritance. In 817, Louis tried to overcome this tradition by issuing an ordinance naming his eldest son, Lothair, sole heir to the empire, while his sons Pepin and Louis were to rule Aquitaine and Bavaria respectively, as kings subordinated to Lothair. Things became more complicated in 829 when Louis decided to include his son Charles, half-brother to the others, in the inheritance by naming him king of central imperial regions like Alemannia, Alsace, and Burgundy. Louis' frequent changes to his will drew valid criticisms from aristocrats who resented being made to swear oaths of loyalty, only to have them later invalidated. The three sons from Louis's first marriage, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis, revolted against Bernard of Septimania and Empress Judith, supposedly to prevent their half-brother Charles from receiving part of the inheritance. However, historians such as Marius Costambeix and Matthew Innes argue the rebellion had more to do with the downfall of Matfrid of Orleans and Hugh of Tours, while Pepin participated due to his frustration with his father's interference in Aquitaine. Lothair briefly deposed his father and placed both him and Charles under custody, but this arrangement didn't last, and Louis regained the throne with the help of his son Louis the German. Thus began the Carolingian Empire's inheritance crisis, which steadily eroded the dynasty's power, prestige, and legitimacy. The ordinance maintaining a unified empire in Lothair's favor was overturned, and plans were made to divide the empire among the four sons after their father's death, with no single emperor. Pepin of Aquitaine and Louis the German were dissatisfied, both having ambitions to rule the empire. By the time Louis the Pious realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late. Spurred on by Bernard of Septimania, Pepin I of Aquitaine rebelled in 831. Louis's former advisor, Count Berengar of Toulouse, remained loyal to the emperor and led campaigns against Bernard of Septimania. As he gained victories, both Pepin and Bernard were forced to come to court and accept punishment. Pepin lost his kingdom to Charles, and Bernard lost all of his positions to Berengar of Toulouse. Then, in 833, the three brothers, supported by the Pope, once again revolted against their father, with the pact recognizing Lothair as sole emperor, while greatly enlarging Aquitaine and Bavaria at Charles's expense. Louis's men deserted him, and Lothair forced his father into humiliating public penance, since morality and sin were the most powerful rhetorical weapons in Carolingian politics. However, the emperor managed to buy enough time for tensions among the rebels to explode. Pepin and Louis the German betrayed Lothair because they didn't want to acknowledge his supremacy. With help from loyal supporters, they defeated Lothair and sent him back to Italy. Although much of the emperor's authority was restored, his prestige never fully recovered. In the Spanish March, Berengar of Toulouse struggled to assert his authority amid the instability. The son of Aznar Galíndez of Urgell and Cerdanya had taken Pallars and Ribagorza, and Bernard of Septimania still had many supporters in the region. For example, the newly appointed Count Sunifred of Urgell and Cerdanya, father of Wifred the Hairy, had to use force to wrest control of Urgell and Cerdanya from Aznar's son, who nonetheless held on to Pallars and Ribagorza for years, later claiming the County of Aragon after the death of García de Abad's earliest son. To resolve this dispute, Emperor Louis summoned Bernard and Berengar, but Berengar died en route. Since Bernard of Septimania had helped defeat Lothair and had lost his brother Gauselm in the war, the emperor decided to reward him with Berengar's counties, including much of the Spanish March and Septimania. Bernard governed these territories through viscounts, as he was largely absent, staying close to the political heart of the empire and participating in the civil wars. After the death of Pepin I of Aquitaine and the failed rebellion of Louis the German, which left him with only Bavaria, the emperor enacted a new division of the Carolingian Empire, expanding Charles the Balt's inheritance at the expense of Pepin's sons, with Lothair's consent. Lothair would retain the eastern portion of the empire except for Bavaria. Pepin's followers did not accept this and proclaimed his eldest son, Pepin II, as king of Aquitaine. Louis the Pious was campaigning against the partisans of Pepin and Louis the German when death overtook him in 840, leaving behind a divided empire. The division of the Carolingian Empire. Charles the Bald had been granted rule over West Francia, roughly present-day France, and the Spanish March, but he faced serious challenges. His nephew, Pepin II of Aquitaine, enjoyed the loyalty of the southern aristocracy, and Lothair left Italy and arrived in France with the ambition of inheriting the entire united Carolingian Empire. At the Battle of Fontenoy, Charles the Bald and Louis the German joined forces and defeated Lothair, and the continuation of imperial unity he represented. During this battle, Bernard of Septimania believed himself powerful enough to refuse allegiance to either side, only pledging loyalty to Charles after the battle had ended. But this marked the beginning of his downfall. The king of West Francia obviously didn't trust Bernard, and rightly so. Bernard later supported the defense of Toulouse, loyal to Pepin II of Aquitaine against Charles's forces. He was captured and executed for his betrayal. In 843, the Vikings began to devastate the Carolingian wall. The Bretons rebelled, and both Burgundy and Aquitaine were in turmoil. This crisis led the brothers to reach an agreement, the famous Treaty of Verdun, which excluded Pepin II from the inheritance and divided the empire into three parts. Charles retained the western territories, Louis the eastern ones, and Lothair the so-called Middle Francia, which included northern Italy and stretched through Burgundy to the Low Countries. Nationalist historiography has mistakenly portrayed the Treaty of Verdun as the founding moment of modern European nations. In reality, the Carolingian lands underwent many more divisions and reunifications, and political culture remained Frankish, not distinctly French or German. Leading aristocrats continued to hold lands and interests across different Carolingian kingdoms. The goal of the Carolingian kings was not to create nation-states, but to emulate Charlemagne's legacy. That's why different family branches vied for the imperial title, to place themselves above other relatives, even though, as we've seen, that title of emperor wasn't especially significant to Charlemagne himself. The Carolingian Empire did not cease to exist in 843. The political horizons of the various Carolingian kings and their followers extended beyond their respective kingdoms. It was precisely the imperial idea that drove the Carolingians to fight each other, not emerging national forces pulling them apart. We must be cautious with simplistic rise and fall narratives of empires in hindsight, as they can blind us to the reality that political decisions, then as now, are often short-term and unconcerned with long-term historical trends. The political dynamics of rivalry within the Carolingian dynasty, the shifting allegiances of nobles between kings, and external threats from Slavs, Muslims, and Vikings created profound instability. Eventually, these factors eroded the Carolingian dynasty's legitimacy and power, leading to the rise of new dynasties after the death of Charles the Fat in 888, which marked the definitive collapse of the Carolingian Empire. Returning to events after the death of Louis the Pious, in the Spanish March, Count Sunifred I of Urgell and Cerdanya successfully repelled a military expedition sent from Córdoba in 841, which had aimed to exploit the Carolingian Empire's instability. His success in repelling the Muslim campaign earned him rewards in the form of extensive lands north and south of the Pyrenees. After demonstrating loyalty to Charles and following the death of Bernard, Sunifred was appointed Marquis over most of the counties in the Spanish March and Septimania, including Barcelona. Adjacent to his domains lay the Kingdom of Aquitaine, which was being ravaged by the Vikings. There, Charles the Bald's large army was defeated by King Pepin II and William, son of Bernard of Septimania. The severity of the Viking destruction forced Charles to recognize Pepin II's control over most of Aquitaine, although it was at least nominally under Charles's rule. The situation worsened when the invaders captured William of Septimania, and Pepin failed to protect Bordeaux from Viking raids. However, this crisis became an opportunity for Charles the Bald to present himself as Aquitaine's savior, prompting many nobles to swear allegiance to him. Fearing what was to come, both Pepin and the Vikings joined forces, concluding it would be best to free William and let him open another front to ease pressure on Aquitaine. William of Septimania then attacked the Spanish March. He likely killed several of its counts, since it can't be a coincidence that the father of Wilfred the Hairy, Suñer of Empúries, and the Count of Razès and Conflent all died in 848. However, William's control over the Spanish March was short-lived. Though he received support from Abdelrahman II to raid the counties of Barcelona and Girona, he was eventually defeated and executed by the army of the King of West Francia. Barcelona was occupied and sacked by Arab forces, though for some reason they decided to withdraw. The count appointed by Charles died in its defense. Meanwhile, Musa ibn Musa, governor of Tudela, captured the Duke of Gascony. Thanks to Charles the Bald's intercession, the Duke was released, and in turn, the Duke captured and delivered King Pepin II of Aquitaine to Charles in 852. By the time Emir Abdelrahman II died, it seemed the King of West Francia had finally overcome his greatest obstacles. He had subdued Aquitaine and Gascony, crushed William's rebellion, signed peace with the Umayyads, and entrusted the Spanish March to a trusted ally.
The verdict!
In today's verdict, I want to highlight a point that was neither anecdotal nor exceptional in the 9th century. Religious boundaries did not prevent political alliances. While the Astor-Leonese kingdom had a more militant, intransigent form of Christianity from its beginnings, even there we find cases of alliances with Muslims, or even submission to Córdoba. In the Spanish March, I've already mentioned two revolts in the first half of the 9th century where rebel leaders sought help from Córdoba. Aizo may have been Muslim if he was indeed Aisun, but William of Septimania clearly was not. Once again, religious lines were crossed in pursuit of greater interests. The most paradigmatic example of alliance with Muslims was the kingdom or lordship of Pamplona under the Arista dynasty. This polity remained within the Andalusi political orbit and was regarded in Córdoba as a provincial government of Al-Andalus, albeit ruled by a Christian prince. Though there were Christians in Vasconia who used anti-Islamic rhetoric, aligning with Córdoba offered more political autonomy than drawing close to the Carolingians. That's why Íñigo Arista and his successors had no issue forging alliances and even family ties with prominent Muslim figures in the Upper March. All of this, once again, undermines the traditional national Catholic narrative of the Reconquista. And with that, the verdict ends. Before you go, please consider subscribing to the podcast, or even better, the YouTube channel of New History of Spain, where you will find more content besides this chronological series, like a biographical 5-episode series on Juan Marc Ordinas, Spain's richest man for much of the 20th century, and a key figure in our history, including his role in helping Franco win the Spanish Civil War. If you really enjoy my work, visit patreon.com/newhistoryspain to see what perks you will get for helping keep the project going. In the next episode of the main series, we'll explore the reformist rule of Emir Abdelrahman II of Córdoba and his war against Alfonso II of Asturias. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and see you soon!